and welcome to a new Paint With Me video. This is Lexi and you're on the channel Lexiisartsy, where I chat with you about painting, drawing, creating and all the good stuff. And as you're seeing today, we have a little painting adventure to go on together. This has been a long ride as a painting, and I managed to cut the video down to around 25 minutes long, so take the time to sit down, relax, grab a snack, grab your sketchbook, and come with me to talk about making some magic with acrylics. And as you might have seen in the intro, we had sort of a rough sketch of the painting we're going into. It was actually part of a Draw This in Your Style challenge. I'll put a little link in the description for the original post. The painting is from Artius. She's a very talented artist that does these very moody paintings, often portraits, and this is my interpretation of her Midnight Bride. So you've just seen me preparing my palette of inks. These are acrylic inks by the brand Roller and Klinger. I really like those to clean out my sketch and make it more visible before painting, but also, as we are going to see, for underpainting. So as a start, I clean up the sketch with a kneaded eraser, and I basically go again over every line with a very fine tip brush. This one is from the brand Princeton, if you're curious. I have found that it lasted longer in time than other I tried without fraying. This can be a real problem with fine brushes, especially with acrylic techniques, because those are very hard on brushes' hair. As you've seen, I premixed a variety of colors from the inks. This is because I like to have a good idea of the warm and cool contrasts in the painting before I start covering it with opaque paints, but also with opaque techniques such as gouache and acrylics. Things can get messy down the line where part of the sketch starts to be covered by the paint. So I find color coding is helpful to stay organized when I'm in the process. And I guess you could do this step with any kind of tool. Any waterproof pens such as microns would be fine, but I really love the feeling of doing it with a brush, just because the feeling of the brush sliding on top of the paper is really satisfying to me. And speaking of paper, this is actually the Etcher Perfect sketchbook I'm painting on right now. It's a really good watercolor sketchbook. I actually had this one for a while now, and I really love the paper in it, but I think I've been really intimidated with it. And so I prefer to work on other sketchbooks for some reason. I guess it comes down to price a lot. Given it's a very costly sketchbook, I sometimes struggle to paint in it if I'm not actually using watercolor. Thing is, I'm not using watercolor as much as I used to anymore, because I fell in love with opaque techniques about 2 years ago. I've started to think recently about how irrational it actually is, especially because good watercolor paper is still my surface of choice for painting, whether I'm working in gouache or in acrylics, or like today in acrylic gouache. So I went back to work into it a bit more, and I hope I can finish this one soon, and that will make for a beautiful sketchbook tour video. I'm leaving you with a bit of music for now as I finish the line work. See you in a couple minutes to do the underpainting together. And after a bit of cleaning, picking out most of the pencil dust, the line art is done, and here's what it looks like. We are getting into the underpainting part of the video. Basically, I'm putting a layer of diluted acrylic ink and charging more paint into it when tone wet. The purpose of this step is double. First, I think some of the color shining through the semi-transparent layers I'll put on top can help with harmonizing the colors. Second, I really like to have a rough map of the values before getting into the painting stage, sort of like these artists that are working grayscale to color. Here, it's especially useful because in this painting, the lighting is the statement of the piece, so I need some kind of guidelines to work with so I can get my values right when I be mixing the color as I put on top. We are finally getting into the meat of the video with the acrylic gouache part, and first of all, I imagine some of you might not be familiar with it, so I'll explain a little bit. Acrylic gouache is a type of pen that is supposedly sort of a mix of acrylic and gouache in its properties. No, I'm going to say a bit of a controversial statement maybe, but don't be fooled by the marketing. These paints, I love them, but let's be real, they are way closer to acrylics than to traditional gouache. The thing that is the most gouache-like about them is the fact that they are matte, when most acrylics is slightly shiny, and I also find that, just like gouache, the color reproduce extremely well when photographed or scanned. They are extremely pigmented, which has more to do with the quality of the brand than if it's gouache or acrylics, but they dry even faster than most acrylic does, and contrary to gouache, they can be rewetted to blend with other layers. This is obviously a blessing and a curse. The rewetting of trad gouache can make it hard to not mess with your underlayers, and it makes it basically impossible to cover big mistakes. It also means that you can sometimes ruin a painting just because you dropped a tiny droplet of water on it. This cannot happen with acrylic gouache, and you basically can cover your mistakes until your page gets crusty you want to, although I'm not sure it will be an enjoyable experience. But it also means that it can be a little bit harder to blend smoothly or do painterly effects such as mixing on paper, and dry brushing, as beautiful as it can be, well, it can obviously become limiting quite fast. So you have to pick up a few tips and tricks along the way to achieve different types of effects. The first one you've already seen resides in my palette. This type of palette is called a Stay Wet palette. Basically, there's a flat sponge that you put on the bottom, and then a little piece of special paper that is similar to baking paper. You put the paper on the sponge, and it basically keeps the paint wet without making it runny. I could give more detail in a specific video if you want to, so put a comment asking for that if it interests you. But for now, all you need to know is that it allows for less paint to be lost, which, given the price of paint tubes, is essential. But also, it allows me to keep the paint at the same consistency for all the painting, ensuring it doesn't get too thick. The second tip I have for you is to mix your colors in advance on said palette. In this case, I have a variety of browns at my disposal, all with the adequate consistency. I mixed a more warm brown for my local color, aka in this case a hair color. Then I have browns with more blue and black as it gets in the shadows, because we're in a cold color environment, so the shadows will pick some of that up. For the lighter parts, I mixed some blues and greens, plus a lot of whites in, because the brown is affected by the coldish, bluish lighting of the moon. If you look closely, you'll notice I tried to stay organized while working on the values, starting with the darkest points of the painting where there is no light, and then I blend my way slowly into the lighter values. I try to think of the hair like several masses, several strands that you have to render individually, thinking about where the light comes from. It's a way easier method than painting each hair individually, and I find it looks better as you don't get confused in your values. The third tip I have for you is to pick up a good brush. This one can be a little bit tricky. On the one hand, acrylic techniques are very hard on bed brushes, as I said before, so you need a brush that has some nervousness to it, because if the hair is too soft, it will be damaged and frayed too easily. On the other hand, brushes that are already very hard of hair may harden more as you use it and become too stiff to blend properly. I personally had the best results with this series right here, the Azure by Leonard. These are actually sold as brushes for gouache and watercolor, but they're more on the hard side when it comes to watercolor brushes. They're not too soft like mob brushes. I tried a lot of acrylic brushes and was already disappointed with them, but after finding these, I felt like they were the best of both worlds. I have these for months now, and there's very little signs of fraying. The point stays sharp, and at the same time they stay soft enough to blend very easily. So take this with a grain of salt, but I would rather turn to brushes that are sold as gouache brushes than brush for acrylics if you want to blend well. And while we're into materials, tip number 4. I strongly advise to paint on watercolor paper. And the reason why I say this is because watercolor paper is designed to stay wet for longer, which means if you put enough water in your acrylics or acrylic gouache, it will stay wet for a bit longer and you will be able to use a variety of blending techniques. And you can actually enhance this with tip number 5. I realized while rewatching the footage that most of the time you can't see me do this, but I actually keep a bottle of spray water next to me at all times. I use it to mist the paper lightly so that the surface stays slightly damp but not wet. The reason I do this is because, like the Stay Wet palette, the damp paper is keeping the paint that is on the surface wet for a little longer, which is great to mix different colors together directly on paper, which is basically what you're doing when you're blending. Now, our tip number 6 will definitely be go big to small. You probably see in the footage that I'm doing several passes on the part I'm working on. For now, the hair. Basically, my first preoccupation is always to get the value right for the thing as a mass. In this case, the hair is a big mass where part of it are in the light, parts that are directly around our main light source, in this case the moon, and then there are parts that are in the shadows, especially around her neck, but also the part that wraps around her shoulders. I try to focus first on getting that hierarchy right for the whole shape, and then if the individual strands of hair or the edges or the temperature is not right, I know I can still fix it later in the second layer. I'm leaving you with a bit of music as I finish the hair, and after that you will hear a quick announcement from Real Time Painting Lexi, and I will come back again after that for a few more tips. So sorry, I ran out of battery while I was painting, and I continued a little bit in the background, a little bit of the veil right there, and also a little bit, like just putting a little bit of tone on the skin. There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm quite happy with it for now. See you later to finish the painting. Now, as you can see on that first evening, I ended up pretty much finishing the work on the hair, and I started to work on the veil as well. I thought we could talk a bit about the rendering of clothing here, because I think we have two different materials that are equally interesting. So first for the veil. You might see that I basically work almost in reverse on what we actually usually do for clothing. Usually you'd probably get your light values for the flatter part of the shape, and then the part where there are little folds, you would have darker values because light don't get there. It's obviously a little different for transparent materials like this. In this case, the veil is resting on a dark object, a hair, but it's not 100% transparent like glass would be, so the hair color is a little bit affected by the color of the veil. So I basically mixed the color of the veil, a bluish grayish white, and then I added in some of my local brown in the parts where the veil sits relatively flatly on her head. On the other hand, where there are folds, I added more of the grayish white to the mix. This is because in the fold, transparent materials are in perspectives, so the strands in the weaving are, in a way, concentrated into a tighter space, like the windows on a building in perspective. And what it will mean is that in these places, the color of the veil is going to be more visible compared to the object that will be directly behind it. On that second day of the painting work, I actually did pretty much all of the work on the dress too, so I thought we'd talk a little bit about that. You might notice that even though the dress is white, I'm barely ever using white to render it. The reason for it is that I want to establish that the overall lighting of the piece is dim. If you're looking at white objects in a rather dark, nightly environment, you'll find that they're usually not white at all. Basically, they're going to be white only where there is a very bright light source that is shining directly at them. In this case, that will be your little moon. The medium value will be a rather light one, but not too much, and generally speaking, the color will be affected by both the color of the light and the environment. And because the sky is a grayish blue, This is the color that will be reflecting on the dress. And then you'll have the deepest folds, where the color will get darker because there's barely any light getting through. Another reason why you don't want to go too light in value when trying to paint glowy scenes like this, even if you're painting a light object, is contrast. This is basically my ultimate tip when it comes to painting bright light. No matter how light your object is, if the environment around it is not dark enough, it will not look bright, because it's the contrast that gives us the impression of brightness. Here you see me starting to work on the face. It was definitively the longest part to render, and you will see why in a minute, but I generally followed the same recipe that I did in the other parts. First I tried to establish the planes that would barely get any light, and mark them in. Here it will be stuff like deep folds in the skin, nostrils, folds on the side of the nose, inside of the ear, and so on. Then I mix the shadow color that I used on all the areas that are not facing the light source. I tried to mix a very greyish lavender for this. The thing was that because the color of the skin is basically a light orangey pink color, and that the environment reflecting on it is more of a turquoisey blue, the result of the color mix would be a slightly dull purple. I think I could have got away with a more frankly bluish color here, but I feel it was an okay choice. And then on the other parts of the skin that are facing the light, I tried to get a very pale, almost greenish color. Like on the other part of the painting, you'll see that I am focusing first on the values, before actually trying to fix temperature problems. This means the painting is spending a little bit of time in the ugly stage, because of the color I'm using on her face, in both the shadows and the light are cold leaning, and then I came back to the face with a series of slow pinkish glaze, and I applied them to the transitions between the light and shadows to warm up the skin in some areas. Yesterday I kept on painting. I actually ran out of batteries. I worked a bit on the face. You might see that a lot of things have changed since the last video. There's not too much to finish, I think. We are getting close to the end of the painting. So we are going to try to finish the painting today. I'm taking you with me to do it, so stay tuned. We are getting into the last chapter of the video, where I basically did all the finishing touches on the painting. So what you're gonna see next is mostly a series of small adjustments and tying up all the loose ends that were still in the painting. So first off, I'm actually finishing the veil. I had left some space in white in the part where the veil is actually between us and the background. So obviously I had to fill that out. I worked a little bit differently than what I did on the part that was on her hair. I started to mix sort of a greyish blue, and I sort of applied that color where the veil was not doing any folds. And in every place that had folds, I basically started to push the color more towards white. You can still see me do some of the temperature adjustments in the face here. I'm putting a little bit of pinkish glaze on some parts of the face to just warm it up a little bit, because she seemed a little bit dead there. Here you can see it on the nose and on the eyelids as well. Building glazes is a good way to build color transitions as well, but it takes a little bit longer than to blend wet on wet, because you have to wait for each glaze to dry before applying the next one. It's a really good way to work though, especially at the ending stages on the painting, and also to add more luminous effects as glazes, because you can see all of the layers that are under your last glaze. It has this very luminous appearance where you can have the impression that there is light shining through your color layer. Now you see me starting to render the ends. The ends were actually the part that were the most difficult to paint, as they often are. Ends are quite hard to render because you have to manage the light transitions in very small cylinders and very complex little parts. So it's always a bit of a bit of mental math there to do what you have to do. And because I had lost the shape a little bit here with the very bright light shining on the palm, I started to apply a bit of a line art there first before starting to do the last small adjustments. And just like in the face, I proceeded with very thin glazes, both to put a little bit of warmth in some parts of the ends, but also to deepen the shadows in some places. The next step was starting to work on the lace of the veil. So I started with a layer of grayish blue as a background for the lace, and then, as you're gonna see in a minute, I went back with a very thin brush, the same liner brush that you see me use at the start of the video actually, to apply very thin little white lines all along the border of the veil. I did not try to paint the lace too perfectly. I was trying to go for more painterly, energetic kind of effect, so I went with the flow when I painted the lace. I didn't really try to follow a pattern or anything. And then when I was done with the lace itself, you can see that I came back with glazes of bluish grays, just to add in a little bit of shadow, a little bit of depth on the veil. And then there were some other hair details missing because I had pretty much finished the veil. I was able to go back a little bit and try to clean up the border of the hair. And I also came back in to paint the lashes that I was really dreading to do, because sometimes you can really ruin a good painting with some lashes that are misplaced. The thing with lashes is they can really make or break an expression, because basically they can give us a lot of information about the direction of the gaze. And obviously it was important for this painting because I had to make it clear that she was gazing at the moon. I'm leaving you with music as I finish to rework the line work of her hair, and then we'll have a little talk about how I reworked some of the other light sources in the painting. So as you've seen, I've been adding some white dots in her hair, and then I've been diluting the edges with my paintbrush to create sort of a blurry effect. I also came back with a bit of a mix between this color and the brown to create a more smooth transition. And then I added some pale turquoise and a little bit of a white dot in the center for each star to seem like it's glowing. I reworked the earrings with kind of a similar effect. Basically, I put back a layer of white to clean it up, and then I put a white glaze to make it seem like it glows, and a series of glaze to both paint the transition and also add a little bit of a turquoise lighting at the edge of the objects. I'm leaving you with music as I'm tying the painting, and then we'll have a bit of a reveal and a few last words. And with the painting sign, my work is done, and here's what it looks like. So what do you think? What do you think of the painting? What did you think of the process? Tell me what you think in the comments. It always helps to have some feedback. You can also tell me what you'd like to see next, since the channel is relatively new. If you liked it, you can also put a like on it, you can also share it, and of course, you can subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Here are some other videos for you to watch if you want to, and in the meantime, have some fun painting and stay artsy!